Check out this animated shot we put into my latest short film, Big Break. In this video, we'll break down exactly how we pulled it off. Sammy! Hey there, I'm Jordan, and welcome back to my channel. I'm a narrative writer, director, and producer based out of LA, and have been working in the industry for the last 10 years. And this channel is all about filmmaking techniques, the philosophy of art, creative and technical workflows, and what filmmaking can teach us about life. So how exactly did we achieve this traditional 2D animated shot in this film, and why? Well, let's get into it. The film. My short film, Big Break, is a dramedy horror short film about the pressures of acting and being an artist in the entertainment industry, especially when it can be really intense. And you have to perform at your best when you're feeling at your worst. The film follows Riley, who's an actress who's performing her biggest role to date that also pushes her to her absolute breaking point. Big Break asks the question of, what are you willing to sacrifice for your art? I highly recommend watching the full short film just so you can see the context in which the animated shot appears in the film. So I will definitely be sure to link that in the description below, so be sure to give it a watch. The inspiration. At first, my goal was to make the film entirely with practical effects and everything that we could capture in camera and not rely on any visual effects in post if we didn't have to. But as we made our way deeper and deeper into the post-production process, what I ultimately realized was that this film actually would be benefited if we had a little bit of minimal VFX augmentation just to help out with some of the shots within the film. And I really thought that this would ultimately serve the film for the best final product in the edit. Some of these applications included removing small things like a boom shadow in the back of the shot, or removing the very top of a boom mic that just slightly dipped into the very top of the frame that we could see, because there were certain shots and takes that I really wanted to use that unfortunately had those small things, but the performance was better in some of those. I realized I could prioritize the best performance takes from the acting and then just get rid of some of the very small mistakes that are in the frame with minimal visual effects. A couple of the other small practical applications that we used visual effects for were creating one fake tear in a shot where it actually needed to be on the other eyeball, but we still really loved the idea of it happening in frame, even though we didn't capture it on the actual day. The other big application we used VFX for was to clean up the contact lenses that are in our lead actress Sarah's eyes, especially when she's in the demon makeup, since unfortunately the contact lenses were a little bit too big and actually bulged out of the eyeball, really destroying the illusion on screen. So having a VFX artist go in and clean up some of the eyes and the contacts just made it feel that much more integrated, but the work was very subtle and very minimal and almost invisible, especially if you didn't know that there was any augmentation going on. These examples of VFX use within the film are often in the industry what they call invisible VFX, since they are a lot more subtle and almost invisible to the naked eye in comparison with the much larger scale VFX that are used in blockbuster films like Marvel films. So this is a very big distinction between using VFX in a much more subtle, minimal way and using them much more overtly, where you can tell most of the frame is CG augmented. As a director, I personally love visual effects and the freedom that it buys you, especially in post-production, just to open up the creative possibilities or even fix small mistakes in the frame that don't require reshoots. But I'm also a big fan of using VFX very sparingly and trying to capture most things practically and then augmenting with a little bit of VFX. I really think that if most of your frame is real and a smaller ratio is VFX, it's a lot harder for the audience to tell that any VFX is happening. And it's also much easier to preserve the magic trick and the illusion of certain effects that you're using to the naked eye. But I also want to emphasize here how incredibly important visual effects and visual effects artists are. So I know there's been a larger narrative in the film industry recently of downplaying the work of VFX artists and companies, and bigger scale films like Mission Impossible or Barbie, really downplaying in the marketing how many visual effects are involved and making the claim that everything was done practically, when we know that there's a lot of artists who actually worked really hard on the visual effects in these films. They're just more integrated, subtle, or the work is so good that you can't tell VFX is actually happening. This is a great thing and means that the VFX artists are doing an incredible job in doing their job properly. So I really want to do shout out to the hard work that VFX artists, companies, and teams put into these incredibly intricate projects. I also had this incredible realization one day that hit me like a brick. It was an extremely random thought, but it came so clearly defined and vivid in my imagination of the idea of one of the shots of Sarah in the first scene of the film when she's in the dressing room has this incredibly intense scream that she lets out as she's looking at her reflection in the mirror. So I had this incredibly vivid idea of at that moment when she screams into the mirror, the whole frame turns into an old school 2D animated shot in the style of Snow White or Fantasia. And I got really attached to this idea of, for one moment in the film, even though the rest is live action, we have this incredible instance of the whole frame becomes 2D animation in the old school style of Disney for just a couple seconds. And then we return right back to the regular live action narrative and continue on with our movie. And we don't go back to animation at all the rest of the film. So it almost feels like this very eye-catching and stylish choice that draws your eye to it and engages you and surprises you, hopefully. But we also don't overstay our welcome, and we don't just rely on it as a gimmick, and we continue on with our narrative, which is still the most important part of the film. This shot was partly inspired since I had recently just come off working on an animated feature for nearly 4 years with Netflix Animation, and that was my first time working on an animated project really ever. So I really wanted to pay tribute to my newfound appreciation and my experience just recently coming off working in animation and realizing it would be fun to incorporate a little bit of it into this project. I also personally love the old school 2D cell animation that you see in a lot of the old Disney films like Snow White. And I remember growing up and watching Snow White as a young boy and that having just such a vivid visual memory implanted into my brain that I still very much think of, but it also reminds me of being a kid. So I have fond memories of it. And I really wanted to pay tribute to that style of animation and really kind of go old school and have fun with it and experiment as I did it. Narratively speaking, the motivation symbolically was also the fact that in this moment where the main character Riley is having a full-blown panic attack in the dressing room in the film, I loved the idea that this shot of the animation would metaphorically serve the idea that all reality, especially in her head, is broken down in the midst of a panic attack. You totally feel disoriented, discombobulated, and you cannot really make sense of anything that's happening around you. I've had many of these myself. So this animation served the idea that in her head, all reality is completely breaking down. And to the audience, we see this breakdown happen to where the frame goes completely bananas. It changes realities. We're almost in a totally different film for a second. And then we go back to the real world where she finally starts to come back down. So metaphorically, this was the idea that the animation was supposed to convey. But to be honest, I also wanted to try my hand out to see if we could pull off a shot that matched the old style of Disney animation and see if we could just have fun with it and if it would also be a stylistic choice that would add some additional visual flair to this film to really make it stand out. I always try to incorporate at least one new technique that I've never worked with before on every one of my films, and this was the first time I've ever worked with any sort of animation in any of my projects. I think one of the keys here that I also found was to not get too overboard with the animation, but to really only use it in one shot and then continue on with our narrative, mainly because doing it too much would detract from the narrative in my opinion and almost become too flashy, but it also would start to take us into a different kind of project, which wasn't really the project I was trying to make. So I think it's good to get really clear narratively on if you're using effects, especially that are more overt, since this was by far the most overt use of VFX within the film, using it for narrative purposes to help tell the story and not to distract. One of my favorite parts about this is that I had only really decided to do this very overt shot so much later into the process than during pre-production or even production. We were able to make this choice so late into the process, way further into the post-process than you would think. So this gave us options and flexibility in a way that as a filmmaker, I didn't have to get so locked into my earlier vision. But of course, any VFX solutions or bigger shots that you do later into the game will add more time and money to the project, so definitely keep this in mind. The process and workflow. Thankfully, through one of the prior short films that I had done in the past called Takers, which had a lot of visual effects, I met a really awesome VFX supervisor who became a really good friend of mine. He wants to stay anonymous, so I won't use his name, but he really helped me understand just the process of visual effects and the workflow and how to work with artists, how to give better notes, and how to put together a breakdown of all of the needs and the scope of the project so that you can take that out to a VFX vendor or company or an artist, and you can get a very good sense of what the scope of the work is, how many shots, how many frames need to be worked on, what the complexity is, and what it'll require. So the reason for doing this is then the VFX vendor is able to take this breakdown and put together a bid to give you a cost of how much the scope of work is going to run you for the work that's required. So my friend had provided me a breakdown sheet template from the last project, which I was able to utilize and just repopulate with the new scope of work for this project for Big Break. So I'll put a link in the description below to a copy of the breakdown sheet we use for Big Break so you can see it in more detail. But you can also check out right now some images of the breakdown sheet we use for Big Break. So some of the things that go on the breakdown sheet are, of course, the different frame thumbnails of the shots that you're going to be working on. You want to put the number of frames that's working on too, because this gives a very good sense of how much it's going to cost. And they can bid it out by frames versus minutes or seconds. Most VFX vendors work off frames and not other units of time. The other things that you want to populate within this breakdown sheet are references or inspiration, such as links to projects that have a similar look that what you're going for, or any photos or videos, or just notes that give a good idea for what is going to be required for that respective shot. And you want to do that for every single shot on the spreadsheet for the breakdown. Some of the other information that it's helpful to put in there is camera that you used, the resolution and the specs and the codecs, as well as the lens, or if there was any filters in front of the lens. These are all things that you want to try to list in the breakdown, along with things like the camera height. You can also list things like if a clean plate was shot for that respective shot. A clean plate, if you don't know, is just a shot where you'll shoot the subject in the frame doing a certain action, and then often you'll shoot that shot again with the subjects taken out so that you have an option to layer it in post that the artist can composite if they need to. So after I filled out this breakdown sheet, trying to get as specific as possible and really calculate out the number of frames and all the other pertinent info, I sent this back to my friend, the VFX supervisor, and he connected me with a really good Indian VFX company called Boss VFX. So typically VFX supervisors are very connected to a handful of different VFX artists or VFX vendors and companies that have a roster of artists that typically specialize in different kinds of VFX work. Some of that could be rotoscoping versus compositing versus match moving. There's a lot of different specific fields that artists become experts in. So a good team will often have a wide variety of types of VFX artists working on one shot. And so in this case, my friend was able to send the breakdown sheet that I completed to a handful of different companies that he thought might be good for the price point and the scope of work. And he had them bid out the cost for the scope of work. Boss VFX from India ended up having the best quote for the scope of work that worked with my budget as well. And the next step was me to get directly connected with Boss via an email thread that my friend set us up on. So once we've been connected via email, I resent the breakdown sheet along with a much more detailed description where I actually wrote out in an email a lot of the different things I was looking for specifically for the animated shot. That required a lot more description and references because it was much more of an involved shot than some of the other more minor fixes and corrections. So that was one that obviously ended up costing a lot more and had more work frames because of the complexity involved versus some of the more minor fixes like removing a boom shadow or fixing the contact lenses. So that's one thing to consider, is the complexity of your shot and the amount of frames very much can dictate the more expensive price and how long that shot's going to take. So that often will dictate a longer time frame. You can check out my descriptions of some of the things that I wrote to them in that initial email about the design I wanted and the style of the animation. And part of this was just to see if they had the ability and the resources to pull off the shot the way that I was looking for. After I sent them this initial description of the scope of work with some references and photos and videos to steer them in the right direction, they sent me back a couple different questions just to clarify or add even further detail just to be even more clear on what I wanted. And after we got a very good back and forth and they understood what I wanted, I then had to send them the appropriate files so that they could start to work on. The key here is specificity. You really want to be extremely specific with every single detail that you're looking for as a director so that your artists know exactly what you're trying to achieve and they can get it done in the least amount of iterations as possible. This just makes it more ideal for everybody and gets you what you want much quicker and closer to what you want sooner, rather than having to do as many iterations and cost you more time and money. So down to the shade of color of how you want it. The other key here is you really want to try to point to real world examples that show the physics of the movement or point out references that are very, very close to exactly what you're trying to pull off. And this is always going to help you get the artist much closer to what you're looking for. We then worked out some of the other questions like the finishing specs of the film and what types of files and codecs I needed to export to send to the VFX artist to work on, which they'd call the plates. So once I had those worked out, I was basically the post house on this. I was able to go in and export out each shot. And usually what you want to do is export with 8-frame handles, which are essentially just extra handles that you have at the beginning of the shot and at the end of the shot, which they call the head of the shot or the tail of the shot. And the reason you do this is so that the artist is working on a couple extra frames so that in case you need a little more room in the edit just to have an extra second or two on the front or back end of the shot, this gives you that latitude and that freedom just so that you're able to plug it into the edit successfully. So once I exported all of the different shots with 8-frame handles on the head and the tail, I sent this back over to Boss VFX and they were able to commence the start of the VFX work. Notes and refining the shots. After sending over all the plates to Boss VFX and they started on that first batch of shots to send over to me for my approval. So that was really the VFX workflow of how we worked on this film. Is they would send me batches of shots, usually about 3 to 4 in a batch, and I would go through and we used Frame.io for me to review the shots, and I was also able to put notations and put notes on specific things that I needed if the shot still needed more work. This was really helpful because I could directly comment or annotate on the frame with arrows or be very, very specific if a shot still needed a little bit more work to get approved. Typically within 1 to 3 revisions of a shot, I would give approval on that shot to be finalized, and then they would move on to their next batch of shots to start work on. Usually what you also do is for a shot that has a little more creative art direction or styling and is more complex, usually you want to have some kind of visual or a graphic or an illustration or a mock-up. That way they can send it to me as the director. I can look at the mock-up and say, hey, this is in the ballpark, or no, the design needs to completely change to something that's a lot more closer to what I'm looking for. So in this case, they did send me a mock-up of what the animation style would be just for a still frame over the actress Sarah, who's in the dressing room. And initially, that very first image they sent me on the call looked a little bit more of an anime style, so much more of a modern day style of animation, which was not what I was going for. So I was honest with them on that call and said, hey, I'm looking for much more of an older style of animation, much more like Snow White. And again, the biggest reference that I kept providing to them was the witch in Snow White, mainly because her eyes are very big and buggy and they are so expressive on a character, even in animation. So I thought this was such a great reference to give them because I wanted the eyeballs on the character to be big. I wanted it to feel like it's larger than life. And again, pay tribute to that older style of animation that I really fell in love with and I have so many fond memories of myself. I also love the colors within a certain scene in Snow White where the witch is stirring the cauldron and you get to see this incredible array of colors that just look so magical. So I also wanted to recreate not only the visual style of the witch within Snow White, but I also love the colors and I wanted to recreate some of those within the frame as well when the animation happens. So Boss continued to work on some of the more minimal shots that I was able to approve relatively quickly, and all the while they were preparing a new mock-up of the animation style that they could send my way. Thankfully, the newer mock-up looked much closer to the style that I was really going for, and they gave me 2 different options, and one of them I chose that looked a lot closer to the Snow White style that I really wanted to try to achieve in the final product. After approving that initial mock-up, they then were able to actually go to work on animating that shot with one of the 2D animation team members that they had at the company. So eventually they were able to deliver the very first pass of the shot through Frame.io, and I have to say that very first pass of the shot was incredibly close to what I was looking for. I was so impressed that they not only were able to pull off the style, but even the timing and this cloud of smoke that emits from behind Sarah's head within the frame while she's animated. It all looked amazing, and the way it even transformed back to the live action plate looked so elegant and organic. It all was exactly what I was looking for. At this point, really what I just wanted to do was tweak small little things so that we could get it to be absolutely perfect in the end product. So then we continued to just go back and forth through Frame.io with a couple different revisions and a couple different notes I gave. And the funny part was that a lot of the later notes I found myself giving ended up undoing great stuff that Boss VFX and the team had already been doing with the shot. So often I found that notes I gave, I actually ended up undoing because their instincts were already so great and were in the right place from the get-go. Eventually, after a handful of passes of tweaking the color of the smoke and the color of Sarah's skin when she's in the animated form, all got us to the finally completed shot as you see in the final film. One of the other things that I was doing every time I'd get a subsequent pass, especially of the animated shot, is I would always put the shot into the timeline with the rest of the edit. And the reason you want to do this is to make sure that the shot with the VFX still works with the continuity, the rhythm, and the timing of the picture lock edit that you already have on your timeline. Because sometimes VFX can actually create a jarring edit or it can throw off the rhythm. And this is something you really want to make sure of, especially before you approve a final shot. So one of the things that I was really looking for when I put the shot into the timeline before approval was that the timing of the smoke really worked out with the timing of when her face is on screen. Everything looked organic, and even the timing of how long she was animated before she went back to being live action all worked with the scene. Otherwise, it wasn't going to work. So some of the notes I gave even had to do with just the timing of how long her face was animated and then how quick the transition into animation and then out of it was. So sometimes those small little details down to the smallest frame really do matter, especially when you're working with VFX. Eventually, we got the shot fully approved and we worked through every other shot on the scope of work until I had approved everything and we had called all the shots final. At that point, you want to make sure to get the full size resolution renders in the aspect ratio of the project that you're finishing in. That way you can plug them back into the project, make sure they work, and the quality still upholds when you put it back into your timeline. Completion. The other thing you really want to look out for is that your color grade isn't thrown off by any of the VFX work or shots. Typically what you want to do is work on all of the shots and get all the VFX done before you grade the film. That way when you're grading everything uniformly so it looks integrated and it looks like a seamless whole. But sometimes in this case, we did a little bit of the grading before and then just retained and baked some of that into the shots after. The other thing that I found you can really do, especially once you move into the sound design and the scoring phase, is sometimes sound design can really enhance the effect of what a cool visual effect can be. And so I told my sound designer Sam that I really wanted him to work sound design, really work in specific sounds and elevate the roar of the sound so that this would enhance the visual effect itself and make it look even cooler and more menacing than it was by using sound to complement the visuals. I also told my composer that this was a very important moment, and because of this motif of reality totally breaking down with the animation, I wanted to serve this not only with the music, the visuals, but also with the sound design at the same time. So these things are all working hand in hand, and as a director, it's important that you're pulling the strings of every department to make sure everybody knows when certain things have to hit harder than others in the structure of the film. And if you are going to use visual effects and you know that before you enter production, really think about what kinds of sounds would complement the visual effects, because that sometimes can inform the way you end up pulling off the VFX or the way you tell the artist to work on the shot. So really consider sound as an ally in the VFX and visuals process. To recap, my major key takeaways from this process and just working with VFX in general are as follows. Number 1, be extremely specific with your references, notes, and communication. Number 2, Do your proper homework and preparation. Really make sure to spend time pulling the appropriate references, write out as many sentences as you need to detail what the work is. And one of the other things that I highly recommend is to utilize screen share videos where you record your screen and you talking it over, especially in front of the timeline or a reference that you have. And this allows you to make notes much more quickly, but you can talk out and explain in detail over some of the more specific and intricate details that you're trying to pull off with the shot. But it also makes you just a much better collaborator and communicator. Number 3, be encouraging, patient, and support your VFX artists and team since they work extremely hard. Number 4, don't be afraid to ask respectfully for another pass or revision if the work isn't quite there yet. And this is something you're never going to regret, especially once you finish the film and you put it up on a screen in front of an audience. You're always going to be so happy you took the extra revision, attention to detail, and pushed for excellence. Number 5, highlight and celebrate your artists after it. Once the film is done, make sure you credit them properly in the credits based off their desire. Make sure you ask them how they want to be credited. But also when you share the film and promote it, make sure to highlight the team that worked on it. This can help them land more future work, but also this can help more people in the industry just be aware of the company and the work that they do. And please don't downplay the role of VFX in your films. There's nothing wrong with utilizing visual effects. This whole narrative of these bigger films downplaying and understating the prominent role that VFX play in these movies is not only inaccurate, but it really does a disservice and is disrespectful to all of the hardworking professionals who are a part of the VFX community. That concludes how we animated a Disney-inspired shot into a live-action film. I want to hear from you. So what did you think of this shot? Or did you learn something new about the VFX workflow or process? Let me know in the comments below. Let me know if there's any other future technical topics or any other topics you want to see covered in a future video, and I will definitely make sure we get them covered. If you haven't already, check out my video on why going into film is still a viable career path in 2024. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will definitely catch you next week where we continue to cover different narrative filmmaking techniques to take your career to the next level. So I will definitely see you then.